And it was the most cringe-worthy campaign you've ever seen. But then what was worse is somebody had created a Twitter bot AI that went through these posts and basically said, here's the gender pay gap for this company.
Oh my
So they
God.
were completely shamed across social media. And it's exactly that, saying you're doing one thing, saying you're one thing, but actually you're another.
So welcome to Gobbo, one and all. I'm really hoping there's going to be more than one person listening to this. But anyway, we'll see how we get on. Today, I'm going to have a chinwag with someone I know is incredibly passionate about company culture. My guest today is my friend and colleague, Lizzie Benton. Lizzie is a culture specialist who supports organizations and businesses in developing purpose-driven cultures. She's been featured in the Metro, Huffington Post, Forbes, and the Financial Times, and is best known for her honest approach to culture evolution. Lizzie has worked across multiple sectors, including advertising, marketing, technology, construction, charities, and not-for-profit, just to name a few. So welcome, Lizzie. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm doing very well, thank you.
Great. I'm really glad that you're able to join us on this particular session. And I was particularly, as I did with the intro about you, I'm really hoping that we're going to have a frank and warts and all conversation about this enormous subject in the time we've got available. Because I think very often, well, in my experience, I think very often it can get glossed over. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to do some culture change stuff, and then the reality hits. So this is an opportunity for us to kind of talk about it and see how we take it. I was wondering whether we should start by laying out the shape of this and
Yeah.
thinking for a moment, what do we actually mean by the term organizational culture?
Yeah, I think so because it is something that's so subjective and it's so misrepresented continuously. And I feel like this is where it can start going wrong straight away from that initial conversation. When you say to people, say, oh, we need something, we need some work on our culture. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what's actually going on?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because I suppose a lot of people, and you may find this, that they'll if you had five people in a room and you individually asked each of them out of earshot of the others, what do you mean by culture? The chances are you're going to have slightly different versions of the story, aren't you?
Yeah, 100%. And it's shaped by so many things as well that, we can experience it all very, very differently depending on where we are in the organization as well. So, every person might have a different idea of what the experience of the culture is like as well, and or what you hear from other people. I'll never forget when I first started Liberty Mind, and when I started talking to people about culture, and they'd say to me things like, oh, well, we've got someone to do our social events. We don't need to hire you. And I'm thinking, what? I'm like, oh, what? So straight away, even when I started the business, I knew that this concept of culture was getting really misrepresented and misunderstood.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I mean, look, if you go to any sort of averagely large library and go to that section was about organizational behavior, there's probably shelves and shelves full of books on culture. But I really like the idea that you've mentioned around how people experience it, because the other thing I think you get is subcultures. An organization might decide it's got a good handle on what it's the culture they'd like to have, but that's not necessarily the experience that different teams or different functions, departments might have from another team or another functional department.
Yeah, it is true. And I think from me as well, too often at the moment, this is really happening. I don't know whether it's a post-COVID situation or what's going on, but it seems to me as though culture is almost a word people are using to try and change people's behavior as well. So it's almost, one of those things where we're inadvertently trying to manipulate or influence someone's behavior in the organization. And so culture gets labeled as that thing that they need to work on. And what ends up happening is, you know, a lot of the leaders or people in HR have got an idea of what the culture want to be, and they kind of try and enforce that onto everybody else, which is a really inauthentic culture.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, because often, when you get into conversations about culture with organizations and how they'd like it to be or whatever. I think it's really telling when you get into a conversation and you then say, well, what for? Why do you think you need to be doing something about your culture? And I think usually they end up where you've just suggested that they're actually really talking about the behavior they're experiencing from one another, etc. And you hear this phrase very often. I mean, obviously, if you looked at all the books, there'd be some big, deep psychological or organizational psychology description of what culture is, and the norms and the symbols and everything else. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like the way we do things around here and what it's like to be part of this place, and how we work with one another. So I suppose ultimately it all ends up being to do with behavior.
Yeah, it completely does. And I think that's the thing. We have a misconception that we can shape the culture and therefore the culture can then shape behavior. And it's really I don't feel like that can happen. It's something we can't manufacture. I think that's what's the really hard part is people have to understand that they already have a culture, even if they don't really think they have one. They definitely have one. And then they try to manufacture a culture, and that isn't possible. And especially the way that it's done as well, it always kind of grinds my gears because I'm just kind of like, that's not what's going on here. If you're trying to influence someone's behavior, you can't force them to act and behave a certain way just by doing this kind of culture work and acting like, oh, this is all okay. We're doing this lovely culture work when secretly the undertone is we don't like how you're behaving and we want you to change.
Yeah, I really 100% agree with you, particularly with this point about the things that grind your gears. I love that phrase because I think that it's the behavior that influences the culture of the organization, and probably underneath that there is a whole sense of values and how people sort of orientate themselves to the world and the people around them and how they feel about being here, etc., etc. And ultimately, that leads to the culture you want or the culture you don't want. But it is about how people are operating. I wrote a paper. This now feels like centuries ago, but I wrote a paper on that title. The title was "Culture: Help or Hindrance." So in other words, is it helping you achieve what you want to achieve, or is it just getting in the way? And I mean, we've all seen it, and a lot of organizations will tackle culture from the point of view, or we ought to do something around vision, and then we ought to have our values plastered all over the walls and the entrance and reception and that kind of thing, and our website, etc. And it drives me potty is that it's all well and good having the piece of paper, but if nobody operates that way, you might as well have not bothered, frankly.
Yeah, a lot of these as well kind of end up being too wrapped up in kind of marketing and PR exercises these days. This culture washing that goes on is something that, keeps happening. And unfortunately, brands are really tripping over themselves, in the press and in the media, because they'll come out and say one thing and then something else will happen and you'll be like, well, hang on a minute, but didn't you just say this and now you're doing this? You're
I
not
love
actually walking your talk.
I love that phrase, culture washing. Say a little bit more about that. What's your take on this notion of culture washing?
Yeah, so culture washing is where you pretend to have you put exterior from the external, you put out that you have a certain type of culture when the internal culture is very different from what you actually have. I mean, there's so many examples. I think the last year, I think there was a really good example last year of a particular company who, put out, I think it was International Women's Day, for example, and they put out this campaign with lots of female leads going, I'm Fiona and this is my job role, and all of this. And it was the most cringeworthy campaign you've ever seen. But then what was worse is somebody had created a Twitter bot AI that went through these posts and basically said, here's the gender pay gap for this company.
Oh my
So they
God.
were completely shamed across social media. And it's exactly that, saying you're doing one thing, saying you're one thing, but actually you're another.
It's really interesting. Years and years and years ago, I worked for an organization and where I was trying to figure out what was the culture really was. Of course, it didn't take me more than about a day. Example. So the headquarters which is in the City of London. That might give you a clue already. We had a butler on each floor. I was shocked to on my about third day when I had my induction. I was given an envelope with a key in it, and the key was to the executive bathroom. And about 3:30, this lady would walk down the corridor, sticking her head around the office doors, going, "Would you like a cup of tea, sir?" Honestly, it was like something out of the 1950s. Not that I'm that old, by the way, but it honestly, and I thought, no matter what they say to their external market, this is the culture of this organization. Hierarchy, you know, we've got a bigger desk than you, or,
Yeah,
my carpet is more important than, oh,
yeah.
it's bonkers.
Power
Yeah.
symbols everywhere.
Yeah, bonkers, absolutely bonkers. Tell me, how did you actually first get into culture building work? How did that happen for
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, so I started really by complete accident, to be honest.
Like a lot of us.
Like most people, we just kind of fall into something, and really it's that. So I was the head of operations at a marketing agency, and so my sole role there was to do the culture and team development. And I'd ended up in that role because previous to that I was a manager, yuck, um, one of those. And essentially I'd kind of a lot of my own personal development work and my own coaching work that I was kind of doing outside of work, because I'm a bit of a personal development junkie. I was bringing a lot of those tools and techniques into the team because I wanted to help them be the best version of themselves. So I was really kind of coaching and supporting the team in developing, and they became the most sort of successful team within the company. And the guys said to me, Lizzie, whatever you're doing with this team, can you do it for the whole company?
Yeah.
So I was like, yeah, sure. So became head of ops, and that's where I got my kind of role as culture and people development. And I really loved it, absolutely loved it. And so that's where it all kind of started, really, just wanting to bring in as much of those tools and techniques into the workplace that we so often use in personal development
Yeah.
or within coaching. And I that's definitely where I would say my bridge is even now with the progressive organizations that I work with, that those skills are still fundamental to team development.
Yeah, I so agree. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff is all fundamental stuff. My own journey was, people talk about a learning curve. I didn't have a curve. It was vertical, literally vertical. So I joined an airline way back in the early 80s where it was going through massive change. And um, I was only first of all, I was only part-time with the company and only for the summer because I was still doing my PhD. And I thought, well, at the end of the summer, that's it. I'll go off and, do what I'm doing. And that was it. And 11 and a half years later, I left because I got completely sucked in to all that culture change, and it took a long time. This was like that old analogy of the fully laden oil tanker in the middle of the Atlantic, and all of a sudden the captain says, "We're not heading south anymore. We've got to head north," and it takes them 3 days to turn the ship around. It was a little bit like that. There was
Yeah.
so much to do. But what I thought was really, and it's one of the things that's kind of made me think about this was I think they're a really good example uh, of what we're talking about. I'll tell you the company, it's British Airways. A really good example for two reasons. One was it was a great example of how to get the entire workforce, or practically the entire workforce, absolutely engaged in this effort right from the beginning. So it didn't feel like it was both a top down and bottom up approach. And the other thing is they're a brilliant example, they were a brilliant example of how everything can get flushed down the toilet super fast as soon as people start taking their foot off the accelerator. And so, I mean, you can think what you like about BA now, like it or loathe it, whatever. But it was a really fantastic learning ground for me around this subject of culture and what it meant, and it wasn't like a 2-day course sticking plaster over it and everything would have been okay. That's what I kind of noticed about it. Yeah,
Oh
interesting.
my goodness, that must have been such a fascinating time of your career to learn so much from, and from such an incredible brand as well.
And the thing was, I think more than anything else was they really at the senior level. So the chairman down. So chairman was Lord King and the CEO was Colin Marshall, who had come from Avis. And basically, they put their money where their mouth was over a long period of time, and there was so many changes and, building up morale. I remember when I when I first joined British Airways, people used to say, "Oh yeah, BA, that stands for bloody awful." And and do you know what? It was a little bit like it really was like that, for a lot of people. It was bloody awful. But anyway, but they did amazing things. And then obviously the 80s and very early 90s was a sort of a sort of a spotlight for them. But going back to this issue of culture, one of the things I'm always fascinated about is how people get your clients see as their entry point into the subject. So I was wondering, from your experience, what typically might be some of the entry points that, whether it's the head honcho or HR or L&D, how do they approach you about this?
Yeah, oh my gosh, that's such a good question. So I always put it into two camps whenever I think about those that approach me. And it's either those who are aspirational, so they really want to do, like, have a good workplace. So I'll never forget, one of my previous clients were just like, they're a co-founder of a business, and they just said, do you know what? I've worked in some crap places. I don't want to create a crap workplace. And I was like, fair enough. So, you have, and I think that's sometimes where people start, is because if they're starting a business, they're starting it either because they didn't like where they worked, or they've got a really good idea and they know that, that how we work together is really important for success. So I always put it in that, like, aspirational camp. And then the other ones is the ones who have got so much pain, they have to change. Like, they're feeling conflict, they're feeling frustrated, they've got some kind of pain that they have to change. They've left it so long now that they're just like, we actually have to do something about this.
Yeah, I wish I could find a few more of the aspirational ones, because mine tend to be, oh my God, that merger didn't work. It's two different companies and we're so different, or there's been some change, or as you say, the pain, whether it's business pain or something's not working.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really interesting. What would you say from your experience is the kind of like the first thing they want to get into a conversation with you about? Because obviously they have the person you're speaking to is interested in the subject and realizes they want to do something about it. Maybe they are fully committed to it. Maybe they think you're the right person to support them. But how do they think the thing will work out, sort of embarking on this journey? How do you experience that side of things?
I always talk about, what is it, how are we going to measure success? What does success look like to you? So we have that conversation. Because sometimes they might see it as a very, like I said before, PR and marketing stunt. Oh, we just want vision or values because that's going to really change behavior. And I'm like, no, it's not, hun. It's not going to change anything. They're going to sound great. They're going to sound amazing, but that's not going to do anything to anyone else. So, we have to have a very frank discussion about what does success look like. And a lot of the time when they come, it's like understanding that this is a journey, it's a process, and it's not going to be a quick fix. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
we're very used to quick fixes in our everyday modern society now, because everyone's selling a quick fix, whether it's a diet pill or something else. Quick fixes are what we're kind of being conditioned to be used to. So when you say to people that this is going to be hard, deep work, and there's going to have to be, a bit of backwards and forwards they're kind of a bit hesitant. And I think that's where, it is hard to get people to go on the journey, because they have to realize that it is a bit of a commitment, and they can't just do something quick and everything's going to be amazing overnight.
That commitment piece, I think, is so important. I tell you something that I to say I get a little bit frustrated is probably an understatement. But when I obviously the sequence of events for me, a bit like you, is that you have an initial conversation with whoever it might be. I don't know, some senior manager. It could be the HR director, or somebody, I don't know, somebody who's in that subject and wants to talk to you about it. But I always ask, who else is interested in doing this?
Yeah.
because even with the best will in the world, sometimes, and I often see this with HR people, that they know and they can see really clearly this is something that needs to happen. The company has to evolve. We have to have different ways of operating with each other, etc., etc. But no other bugger can see it. Or frankly, we've been really successful, so why should we change anyway? And so trying to get commitment and buy-in from senior people can sometimes be really challenging for them. And, I think sometimes they think that, somebody like you and I can walk in and go, well, here's what you do, and it's all going to be perfect. So
Yeah.
have you found that as well?
Yeah, as if it's going to be completely predictable as well. This is the other thing, that every session that we have is going to be completely predictable to the outcomes. And yes, we can work towards certain key measurements to make sure that we're kind of on the right track, but that doesn't always mean that everything's going to be completely predictable and completely, in line with some employee engagement survey that they've decided to bring out.
Oh, that's the other one. That's the other one, isn't it? We had a really terrible employment survey last week or last month. We've got to do something about our culture. That's the other classic. But I tell you something that I think is probably a truism in all of this is if you don't have the buy-in of the senior decision makers, whether it's the CEO, MD, and that top team, it really does feel like pushing jelly up a hill with a fork with only
Yeah.
two prongs in it or something like that,
Oh my gosh, that is such a good analogy. It is. And you know, I learned my lesson with this the hard way, unfortunately, as a coach. So I got hired by a company, and the guys that were brought in, so there's three that were brought in, the fourth who ultimately was the one running the show. So there was like the HR director, the MD, and there was someone else. So there was three guys, and then there was the CEO, like the top guy, and he was not brought into the culture situation whatsoever. Even though these three guys were like, we have got a serious problem. Like this is bad here, Lizzie. I didn't realize how bad. And so I'm like, great, yeah, we're going through the program of what we've had plenty of sessions together to try and address as many of these issues. And I really didn't realize what a chokehold that one
Yeah.
individual had on the rest of those people and the company. That despite those sessions and despite us working with the teams, nothing changed, because that person was the one who was the key person of influence who was not at all on board.
How do you tackle something like that?
It's really hard, but unfortunately, until that person sees the value in it, you can't influence them, because it needs to be an intrinsic desire to make a change. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, that particular individual was also of a certain age who was kind of stuck in his ways, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and he was like, well, I've been running this business for goodness knows how long. I don't really need to change. So I don't know what all of you lot are on about. But the problems that were happening that were also, making it commercially dangerous for the company to be operating culturally as it was, just meant that, there was some serious people problems were then influencing the rest of the business commercially. So it was just such a, and I kind of ended up saying to them, until I'm afraid he retires, this ship isn't going to turn around, because he's the one at the wheel.
I totally agree with that point about all you need is one very senior, very influential person, and then it's like chucking an anchor over the side of the ship, and it's gonna drag for ages. I do think though that often, maybe not always, but often there are ways around it, and I always think that these people, say the finance director, who's already thinking, how much you asking us to spend on this, right? Like, I think there's definitely an issue around readiness for this kind of effort because it's going to take a while. I think there's some issues around, and this is all stuff that perhaps HR, L&D, and others need to get to grips with. So readiness, I think, is commitment at the top. I think maybe trying to put some kind of business case, even if it's not always hard tangibles, but the business case around it for me is about providing some data. And the reason why I think that's important is because senior people tend, I mean, with exceptions, but they do think about what's the data, whether it's sales data, financial data, what's the picture today. So at some point, you've got to provide data or get, internally the data drawn out that says, look, here's our current situation and this is how it's affecting us. And then I think that all that does is probably just maybe opens up the ears slightly to those who think, do we really need to do this? I think the other thing about that, or having data and be exploring what the current situation is you need to have some kind of reference point to then go, well, actually, we're in at position A and we want to be at position B. How big's the gap? Because, if you've got an enormous organization, that A to B might be really big. Whereas maybe a smaller organization with fewer numbers, let's say, the movement from A to B might be a little bit more manageable over a shorter period of time. So I think these are some of the real things that, people who are charged with go, and usually it's HR, isn't it, or L&D, go and look after culture. Lizzie, go on, sort it out for us. Give it back to us when it's fixed. And thanks to you, dear listeners, for listening to Glimpses of the Blindingly Obvious. You can tap below to get the links and show notes. And if you enjoyed what you heard and you want to hear more, why not follow or subscribe to the show, share the podcast, or tell your friends about Gobbo. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me, Joe Espana, on LinkedIn or get in touch via the website. I'd love to keep the conversation going. Let me have your thoughts, questions, or ideas for topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes. In the meantime, take care, and I'll catch up with you next time. Adios. Hasta pronto. I think I need a cup of tea and a biscuit now.